Today, we're going to look at every execution carried out in November 2025. We'll also cover the case of Tremaine Wood, who was scheduled to die on November 13, but received clemency just 1 minute before the execution was set to begin. Let's get started.
This monster raped and killed a 6-year-old girl, Rebecca Kunesh, in 1979. 1979! Jennings used the court system expertly to stay one step ahead of the needle at all times. He was found guilty and sentenced to die 3 different times.
After spending more than 40 years on death row, Brian Frederick Jennings finally faced his fate in Florida. His name had become linked to one of the most disturbing crimes of the late 1970s. It happened in 1979, in a community where doors were rarely locked and neighbors still greeted each other by name. Nothing on that quiet street of low houses suggested that the night ahead would forever mark the state's judicial history. A child's bedroom, an open window, and a dark impulse about to reveal its most monstrous face.
It was Friday, May 11th, 1979. While the world was talking about Margaret Thatcher's rise to power, in the United States radios were playing Hot Stuff by Donna Summer, and the streets carried the optimistic air of a nation that still believed in progress. On Florida's East Coast, Merritt Island slept under a clear sky, the murmur of the ocean blending with the sound of crickets. The houses, neat and quiet, reflected the calm of a neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to happen. In one of those houses, the Kunesh family was ending a peaceful day. Rebecca, known to everyone as Becky, was 6 years old. She had played in the yard, eaten dinner with her parents, and fallen asleep early with her favorite doll beside her pillow. The room smelled of detergent and dried flowers, the window left slightly open to let in the warm Atlantic breeze. In the silence of the neighborhood, her parents slept without concern, unaware that a 20-year-old man was wandering the streets of Merritt Island that night. He was a member of the U.S. Marine Corps, recently returned from Okinawa, Japan, on temporary leave to visit his family. He drove past the Kunesh home and stopped for a few seconds. Through the window, he saw the small figure of a sleeping child. He watched in silence with the engine running, then drove away. But he didn't leave for long. In the early hours of May 11th, he returned, this time with his headlights off. The young man parked by the curb and moved cautiously toward the side window. He looked around. No one was awake. He pried the metal screen from the frame and set it aside. The room was dark. He pushed the glass pane, opened a narrow gap, and slipped inside. Inside, everything was silent except for the steady breathing of the sleeping girl. He took a few steps across the carpet, leaned over, and in one swift movement covered her mouth and nose with his hand until she lost consciousness. He lifted her in his arms and climbed back out the same window. Outside, the street remained deserted. No dog barked. No one saw him leave. On the way to the car, he dropped her twice, her head striking the pavement. Then he placed her in the back seat. He drove for several minutes until he reached a patch of thick vegetation near a canal. He turned off the engine and opened the door. The sound of insects was the only thing breaking the silence. There, in the darkness, his most monstrous side finally revealed itself. Jennings sexually assaulted the girl. When he was done, he grabbed her by the ankles, lifted her upside down, and struck her head against the ground, fracturing her skull. The girl no longer moved, yet Jennings held her head underwater in the canal for 10 minutes. When it was over, the silence of the swamp swallowed everything. The young man stared at the surface for a moment, then returned to his car. His clothes were soaked, the engine roared to life, and he disappeared among the trees. At dawn, a fisherman checking his trap saw something floating near the canal's edge. He thought it was a doll. As he drew closer, he understood with horror what it really was. He ran to the road and stopped a passing car to ask for help. Minutes later, a patrol arrived. Officers made their way through the reeds and confirmed the unthinkable. The body of a young girl lay in the water. The sun was just rising over Merritt Island, but the air already carried a shadow that would never completely fade. The area was immediately cordoned off. Officers walked along the bank, searching every inch for footprints, traces, or drag marks. Meanwhile, another patrol headed to a nearby neighborhood, responding to a second call. A family had reported their daughter missing since the early morning. In the White House with flowered curtains, the Kunesh family waited, fearing the worst. Rebecca's bedroom was intact, except for one detail that couldn't be ignored. the open window, and the torn screen. There were no signs of robbery or struggle, only absence. The bed was unmade, the doll lay on the floor, and the silence said everything. For investigators, at that moment, both scenes, the canal and the house, became one single story. Within hours, Merritt Island had turned into the center of a massive search. State agents, forensic teams, and divers spread out among the mangroves. Helicopters scanned the area while shocked neighbors came forward to give voluntary statements. No one had seen or heard anything. Technicians examined the bedroom window and found something crucial: partial fingerprints on the frame. The photographic lifts were sent to the crime lab in Orlando. That same afternoon, a county detective noticed a detail that would change the course of the investigation. Among the service reports appeared a name: a local young man recently returned from overseas with an outstanding traffic warrant in Orange County. At first, the finding seemed like a coincidence, but when the technicians compared the fingerprints from the window frame with those in his military record, the match was exact. In addition, the footprints found inside the room matched his boots, the standard issue used by the U.S. Marines. And there was something else. Neighbors recalled seeing a dark car driving slowly down the street on the night of the crime. Jennings owned a vehicle that fit that description, a black sedan that, according to his family, he used to visit friends while on leave. On May the 12th, just one day after the crime, officers arrested him on that outstanding traffic warrant. During questioning, they mentioned that several witnesses had seen him return home the previous night with wet clothes and hair. Jennings claimed he had been fishing, but no one was convinced. That detail, along with the fingerprints on the window and the footprints in the girl's room, was enough to set the case on a decisive path. At 1:00 a.m. on May 12th, he was awakened in his cell for another interrogation. At first, he asked for a lawyer. Then, after a short break, he agreed to talk. Detectives showed him the fingerprint photos, the forensic reports, and the witness statements. In that moment, his expression changed. The steady voice of a Marine began to tremble. Jennings leaned over the table, took a deep breath, and in broken words began to describe what had happened. His confession was recorded on tape. He detailed every step of that night with a coldness that chilled the room. Following that statement, police carried out several searches. They found the damp clothes, a hand-drawn map marking the canal's location, and personal photographs that would later be used as evidence. Officers also reviewed his background, several juvenile arrests for trespassing and unlawful entry. He himself admitted to having a problem with looking through other people's windows. The pattern was clear. What had started as voyeurism had escalated into a crime beyond comprehension. For investigators, the case was closed. The perpetrator was in custody, and the evidence was overwhelming. But the weight of what had happened would never fade. In Merritt Island, windows began to close at night, and families stopped trusting the silence of their own neighborhood. There was no turning back. Brian Frederick Jennings was born on December 9, 1958, in Florida. He was 20 years old when he committed the crime that would define his life. At the time, he was a U.S. Marine, stationed in Okinawa, Japan, and home on temporary leave. To everyone around him, he appeared to be a disciplined, polite young man, proud to serve his country. No one suspected what lay behind that image of order and respect. His voyeurism had begun in adolescence and had grown into a compulsion, a dark impulse that festered in silence until it exploded uncontrollably on that tragic May night. Jennings did not know Rebecca Kunash. There was no connection between them, not even a previous encounter. The choice was random: an ordinary house, a lit window, a sleeping child. What began as a forbidden glance turned into a chain of decisions that destroyed two lives, the victim's and that of the man who never knew how to stop. Brian Jennings was, on the surface, the embodiment of the American ideal: young, patriotic, disciplined, with a promising career and a future ahead. The living proof of how deceiving appearances can be. The first trial against Brian Frederick Jennings began in February 1980 in Brevard County, Florida. The prosecution brought a stark indictment: kidnapping, rape, and murder of a 6-year-old girl. Their argument was clear. The crime had been conscious and deliberate. The state built its case on Jennings's recorded confession, the fingerprints found on the bedroom window, and the matching soles of his military boots. Forensic experts confirmed that the injuries and physical evidence were consistent with his account. When the jury heard his voice, steady, unshaken, describing the events, the courtroom fell silent. The testimony of his cellmate, Alan Kruger, was devastating. He claimed that Jennings had boasted about the crime and recounted details that matched the official report. A forensic psychiatrist testified that Jennings had a predatory personality and a seriously impaired conscience, yet fully understood the nature of his actions. The defense tried to humanize him, a young Marine, unstable, affected by stress from his overseas service and occasional alcohol use. They argued that he had acted on an irrational impulse. But the court-appointed experts were unequivocal. Jennings knew what he was doing and understood the consequences. The jury found him guilty on all counts. During the sentencing phase, the prosecutor requested the death penalty, citing extreme cruelty and moral depravity. The defense asked for life imprisonment, invoking his youth and military background, but the court found no mitigating factors. On May 7, 1980, the judge pronounced the death sentence. Jennings remained motionless, eyes lowered. But the story didn't end there. His defense appealed, and in April 1982, the Florida Supreme Court overturned the verdict due to procedural errors. A second trial was held in July 1982. The outcome was the same: guilty, again sentenced to death, this time by a 9-3 jury vote. Rebecca's parents were forced to return to court and once more listen to the details of their daughter's murder. They said the new trial had reopened wounds that had never healed. Jennings appealed again. In May 1985, the Florida Supreme Court granted a third appeal and ordered another full retrial. The third trial took place in March 1986, this time moved to Bay County to avoid publicity. For the third time, the jury found him guilty. On April 8, 1986, 11 of the 12 jurors voted in favor of the death penalty. On April 25, 1986, Circuit Judge Charles Harris formally sentenced Jennings to death for the third time. In his ruling, he wrote that the murder was committed in a cold, calculated, and premeditated manner without any pretense of moral or legal justification. His fate was sealed. After his third conviction in 1986, Jennings was transferred to death row at Florida State Prison in Starkey. He was 27 years old. There began a life of confinement and repetition, a 3-meter cell, constant light, silence. He wrote short letters, read the Bible, and spent 1 hour a day in the yard, always alone. The appeals continued for decades. In August 1987, the Florida Supreme Court rejected his fourth appeal. In 1991, another appeal was denied. In 1998, the circuit judge denied a motion for a new trial. Appeals filed in 2001, 2005, and 2007 met the same fate. In July 2024, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit dismissed his latest appeal. Over the years, Jennings became a quiet and reserved inmate. Prison reports described him as disciplined, stable, and free of major incidents. He spent his days writing religious reflections on loose sheets of paper, which he kept in a box under his bed. In September 1989, Governor Bob Martinez signed the first death warrant, scheduling the execution for October 27, 1989. The day before, on October 26th, the Florida Supreme Court granted a last-minute stay. Jennings continued to wait without a set date as time and routine turned his sentence into a suspended life. Today, more than 4 decades later, Brian Frederick Jennings remains on death row at Florida State Prison. He is 66 years old and one of the longest-serving inmates under a death sentence in the state of Florida. Over the years, his defense has pursued every possible avenue: federal appeals, clemency requests, and petitions based on new legal precedents. In 2016, following the review of Hurst v. Florida, his case briefly returned to the state Supreme Court. The court ruled that his sentence remained valid as it had been issued under the law in effect prior to the reform. In recent years, Jennings has been left without formal legal representation. From 2022 to 2025, following the death of his attorney, Martin McLean, and a lack of funding for public defense. On October 10, 2025, the World Day Against the Death Penalty, Governor Ron DeSantis signed the execution order. From that moment on, Brian Frederick Leggins spent his final days in the same concrete cell where he had lived for most of his adult life. Prison records described him as calm, devoted to reading the Bible and writing letters to a local pastor. In one of those letters, dated 2019, he left a line that seemed to anticipate his fate. "The silence in here is the echo of my decisions." On the 13th of November 2025, Brian Frederick Jennings was executed by the state of Florida at the Florida State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. local time, closing a case that had remained in the justice system for more than 4 decades. As of now, no official details have been released regarding his last words or his final meal, information that is typically published later by the Department of Corrections. Once those details become available, they will be added in the first pinned comment below.
For more than 40 years, Brian Frederick Jennings has lived in a limbo between life and death, confined to a cell that barely changes with time. His case remains one of the most remembered in Florida, a crime committed by a young man who had everything ahead of him, and a community that never slept the same again. 40 years later, the case of Brian Frederick Jennings no longer stirs the outrage it once did. Time has erased certainties and left only questions. The impulsive young man who crossed a line one night is now a gray, almost unrecognizable figure who has grown old under the shadow of a death sentence. For some, the passing decades have brought neither comfort nor closure. Others, however, wonder whether the man awaiting execution is still the same person who committed that crime. Has justice been served? That's for you to decide. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to hear more stories like this one.
44-year-old Stephen Bryant is scheduled for execution 2 weeks from tonight. Bryant's decision comes as some question the firing squad's accuracy.
After spending 17 years on death row, Stephen Corey Bryant awaits his fate in South Carolina. His name became tied to one of the most disturbing crime sprees of the early 2000s. 9 days in which a quiet rural area was shaken by thefts, arson, and senseless murders. It happened in 2004, in the outskirts of Sumter County. It was an eruption of violence that seemed to come out of nowhere, without warning, without reason, without mercy. In a community where people were used to leaving their doors open, a stranger's smile would never mean the same thing again.
It was Tuesday, October 5th, 2004. Across the United States, news programs were analyzing the debate between Dick Cheney and John Edwards, and presidential polls filled the headlines. In Sumter County, South Carolina, life moved at its usual slow pace. Dirt roads bordered fields of dry corn, neighbors waved from their porches, and the rumble of trucks faded among the pines. Nothing seemed out of place. That afternoon, Stephen Corey Bryant, 23 and recently released from prison, drove through the area in his pickup truck. He had no clear plan. He was looking for an escape from the rage consuming him. He forced his way into a rural home and stole some small items. At a second house, he found a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson pistol. With the weapon in hand, he headed down a dirt road that ran along the river. There, a man was fishing alone. Clinton Brown, 56. There were no words. Bryant aimed and fired. The bullet tore through Brown's shoulder, but he managed to drag himself to his truck and drive to the hospital. His testimony would be the only one from a week that had just begun. 4 days later, on Saturday, October 9th, Bryant reappeared in Wedgefield, a small community west of the county. There he met an old friend, Clifton Dale Gainey, 36. They were co-workers and lifelong friends. Their families knew each other well, shared meals, afternoons of fishing, and family gatherings. That Saturday, they went out to buy beer. The trip was short, just a few minutes of casual conversation. At some point along the rural road, the atmosphere changed. Bryant pulled out the pistol and shot his friend at point-blank range. The body was left lying beside the road in the dim light of the woods. He then drove to Gainey's rented trailer. He opened the door with methodical calm, unplugged the TV, the DVD player, and even the aquarium in the living room. Before leaving, he poured fuel on the floor and set it on fire. The flames consumed the home and everything that spoke of their friendship. 2 days later, on Monday, October 11th, Bryant went a step further. That morning, Willard Irving Teachin Jr., a retired Air Force sergeant, was at home a few miles from the river. He lived with military discipline, guided by routine and the daily calls from his wife and daughter. Bryant arrived claiming he was having car trouble. Teachin let him in, never suspecting that within seconds, Bryant would fire 9 shots. The silence that followed marked the beginning of something even darker. Bryant lit candles around the body, stole a ring from Teachin's hand, and burned his face with a cigarette. Then he grabbed a potholder, soaked it in blood, and wrote on the wall, "Victim 4 in 2 weeks. Catch me if you can." As he ransacked the house, the phone began to ring. Bryant picked up the receiver. It was Teachin's wife. Surprised, she asked if she could speak to her husband. Bryant replied in a calm voice, "You can't. I killed him." There was a pause, then he added, "I'm the Prowler." Minutes later, the phone rang again. This time it was the daughter, Kimberly Dees. "Where's my father?" she asked. "I'm the Prowler," the same voice repeated. When police arrived, the candles were still burning and the message was fresh on the wall. The next morning, fear had a name. Neighbors locked their doors twice. Patrol cars swept the dirt roads, stopping anyone they didn't recognize. In a county of 100,000 residents, no one felt safe. Any stranger could be the Prowler. On Wednesday, October 13th, an employee at a small convenience store on the outskirts of Sumter watched from behind the counter as 2 men talked in the parking lot. They seemed at ease. The younger one spoke little, watching as his companion loaded a motorcycle in the back of the truck. The other, heavy-set and wearing a leather jacket, secured the bike and got into the passenger seat. The employee assumed they were friends. He even saw them smile before they drove off. A few hours later, a hunter traveling along a rural road found a body lying by the ditch. It was Christopher Earl Burgess, 35. He had 2 bullet wounds, one to the chest and one to the head. By then, Sumter County was paralyzed. In just 9 days, a string of robberies, arson, and seemingly senseless murders had sown fear in every corner. No one knew if it was the work of one man or several, but everyone understood that something uncontrollable was moving through the back roads. Shutters closed before dusk, cars avoided stopping for strangers, and children stayed inside. The county's familiar calm had been replaced by a tense, expectant silence, the prelude to a manhunt that was only beginning. The discovery of Christopher Burgess's body marked a turning point. News spread quickly. A hunter had found a man dead on a rural road near Wedgefield with 2 gunshot wounds. Within minutes, sheriff's deputies had surrounded the area. The officers worked in silence, shining flashlights over the dirt and marking the spent shells. Each detail reinforced an idea no one wanted to say out loud anymore. The crimes were connected. Following Burgess's last movements, the investigators arrived at the convenience store. The employee's testimony proved crucial. His description of the man accompanying Burgess, a young driver who had helped load his motorcycle onto a pickup truck, gave them a face to match their suspect. When the bullets recovered at the scene were compared with those from 2 recent murders, the pattern was undeniable. The killing of Willard Teachin and that of Clifton Gainey, linked to an arson fire, bore the same ballistic signature. The pieces fit. Together with chilling precision, the same caliber, the same weapon, the same pattern of violence. Police launched an unprecedented operation. Rural roads were blocked, checkpoints set up, and helicopters circled overhead. In a community of 100,000 residents, no one slept easily. Deputies searched barns, trailers, and abandoned houses. With every passing hour, the net drew tighter. That same afternoon, investigators got the lead they needed. The store clerk had described the truck in detail, and its registration pointed directly to one name: Stephen Corey Bryant, a local resident with a prior criminal record. With a warrant in hand, officers headed to his girlfriend's house where they believed he was hiding. Bryant was there. He didn't resist. He was handcuffed without saying a word. When his name came up in the system, confusion turned to outrage. Bryant wasn't a stranger. Less than 2 years earlier, he had been released from prison after serving an 18-month sentence for robbery. The murders had taken place less than 2 years after his release. He had been on parole and was supposed to report regularly, but no one had been checking on him closely. When officers searched his truck, they found the .40 caliber Smith & Wesson pistol stolen on October 5th. They also discovered personal items belonging to the victims and traces of soot on his clothing, still marked by the fire from Gainey's trailer. When the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, silence fell. The prowler had been caught, but for the families, the damage was already done. In just 9 days, 3 men were dead, and an entire county had lost its sense of safety. There was no going back. Stephen Corey Bryant was born on April 12, 1981, in South Carolina, into a world marked by poverty and silence. According to court records, his childhood was a chain of abuse. 4 male relatives sexually assaulted him for years. No one intervened. That trauma followed him always, a shadow that never stopped growing. His mother drank during pregnancy, and doctors diagnosed him with fetal alcohol syndrome, a neurological condition that impaired his self-control and lowered his IQ. At school, teachers described him as distracted, impulsive, unable to focus. By 20, he had already served time for robbery. After his release, he tried to get his life back on track, working occasionally with Clifton Gainey, his lifelong friend, and later, his second victim. But in the months leading up to the murders, something broke. Bryant pleaded for help from his parole officer and his aunt, saying he couldn't stop thinking about what they had done to him as a child. No one listened. He began using methamphetamine and smoking marijuana laced with insecticide, trying to quiet the noise in his mind. When the violence finally surfaced, it was like an eruption that time had only delayed, and now it consumed everything in its path. Stephen Corey Bryant wasn't born a monster. He was shaped by years of abuse, neglect, and silence. The trial of Stephen Corey Bryant officially began on August 8, 2008, in Sumter County, South Carolina. He was 27 years old and had spent nearly 4 years in pretrial detention. That morning, he entered the courtroom in shackles, head down, wearing a wrinkled gray suit. There were no cameras and no curious onlookers, just the echo of footsteps on marble and the murmur of local reporters. Bryant pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and 9 lesser charges. There was no deal with the prosecution and no promise of leniency. County Prosecutor Kelly Jackson made it clear that the state would seek the death penalty for the robbery murder of Willard Teachin, the most brutal of the crimes. The sentencing phase began on September 2nd and concluded on September 11, 2008. The prosecution presented irrefutable physical evidence, matching shell casings, the stolen weapon, victims' belongings found in Bryant's vehicle, and the testimony of the lone survivor, Clinton Brown, who described how a stranger had shot him for no apparent reason while he was fishing. The defense tried to show another side. They argued that Bryant was a deeply damaged young man, a victim of sexual abuse in childhood, diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome and post-traumatic stress disorder. According to his attorneys, these conditions impaired his judgment and perception of reality. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer, they said, but a broken man who mistook imagined threats for real ones. Psychiatric experts confirmed that he suffered from extreme impulsivity and had a low IQ, but also that he understood the difference between right and wrong. On September 11, 2008, Circuit Judge Thomas Russo read the final sentence: for the murder of Willard Teachin, death penalty. For the murders of Clifton Gainey and Christopher Burgess, life imprisonment. For the remaining charges, robbery, arson, weapons possession, and assaulting a correctional officer, a combined 100 years in prison. Bryant listened in silence. He didn't cry, didn't speak, didn't look at anyone. The die was cast. After sentencing, Bryant was transferred to death row at the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. There, he would spend the next 17 years in a concrete cell barely 2 by 3 meters under constant light and with only 1 hour of outdoor time per day. His attorneys filed appeals immediately. In 2011, the South Carolina Supreme Court reviewed the case and upheld the conviction, rejecting claims of severe mental illness. The court ruled that although Bryant had neurological damage, he had planned the murders with full awareness of his actions. During his time in prison, records showed a persistent pattern of violence. In October 2005, he brutally assaulted a correctional officer and was charged with battery. Days later, he threw urine at another inmate's cell door, prompting his transfer to a different facility. Even in custody, violence remained his language. On January 28, 2025, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals denied his federal appeal, dismissing claims related to intellectual disability and fetal alcohol syndrome. In October of that same year, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal. There was nothing left to do. The execution of Stephen Corey Bryant is scheduled for November 14, 2025, at 6 p.m. inside the Broad River Correctional Institution, the same place where he has spent nearly 2 decades. On October 31, 2025, he chose his method of execution, firing squad. 3 volunteers will shoot from a distance of 15 feet. It will be the first execution of its kind in South Carolina in decades. Bryant, now 44 years old, occupies cell number 32 on death row. In recent months, he has been visited by a chaplain and his attorney, who continues to pursue a final motion to review his mental health diagnosis. He has requested that no press or public witnesses attend the execution. Over 17 years, Bryant has lived in isolation, reading the Bible and writing short notes he keeps inside a cardboard box. In one of them, dated 3 years ago, he wrote, "Sometimes I think God forgave me, but left me here to remember." On November 14th, that wait is set to end. On the 14th of November 2025, at 6:05 p.m. Eastern Time, Stephen Corey Bryant was executed by firing squad in South Carolina after spending 17 years on death row for a 2004 triple homicide in Sumter County. Hours before his death, Bryant requested a final meal that included seafood, stir-fry, fried fish, egg rolls, stuffed shrimp, candy bars, and German chocolate cake. His execution took place inside the small, concrete chamber of the state prison, marking the end of a case that had haunted the community for more than 2 decades.
For almost 2 decades, Stephen Corey Bryant has lived in a limbo between life and death, waiting for a sentence that now seems inevitable. 3 men died at his hands. But behind every crime, there was also a chain of ignored warnings and silences that lasted far too long. If nothing changes, on November 14th, 2025, at 6 p.m., Stephen Corey Bryant will be executed by firing squad. For some, it will be the act of justice that finally closes the circle. For others, just the end of another story where the system arrived too late, far too late. For everyone, was justice served? That's for you to decide.
We have breaking news to report. Richard Barry Randolph's execution date has been set for November 20, 2025.
After spending 37 years on death row, Richard Barry Randolph met his end in Florida. His name became tied to one of the most brutal crimes in the history of Putnam County, a case that in 1988 shocked an entire community because of the extreme violence involved. What began as an ordinary morning in northern Florida ended in horror inside a small convenience store where a woman opened the doors, just as she did every day, without knowing it would be the last time. The execution on November 20th, 2025 set a historic record, the 17th of the year. Under Governor Ron DeSantis, Florida once again led the list of states that most frequently applied the death penalty since its reinstatement in 1976.
It was Monday, August 15th, 1988. While the country debated whether the White House would go to George H.W. Bush or Michael Dukakis, life in East Palatka moved with the slow rhythm of summer, that heat that presses down on the hours and makes every morning feel the same. On one of those corners, under the cold light of the fluorescent tubes that seemed to never turn off, stood the Handyway store. Behind the counter, as every day, Minnie Ruth McCollum balanced the register, prepared the coffee, and arranged the lottery tickets. She was meticulous, known by every customer, the kind of woman who remembered cigarette brands and greeted people by name. By 7 o'clock sharp, she would be ready to start her shift. But that morning, someone arrived first. Richard Barry Randolph knew every corner of the store. He had worked there months earlier under Minnie Ruth's supervision. He knew where the keys were kept when she stepped outside to check the gas pumps, how long the store stayed unattended, and which compartments held money or tickets. In the early hours of that morning, he decided to go back. His plan was simple: get in before the store opened, empty the hidden compartment, take the lottery tickets, and disappear without leaving a trace. But plans that depend on silence tend to shatter easily. And it was Minnie who caught him opening the cash register, wearing a store apron he should not have been wearing. She asked what he was doing. She got no answer. She only felt the first shove. The attack began with a blunt, direct violence, nothing like the clumsy desperation of an amateur thief. Minnie staggered back, fell against a crate of sodas, tried to shield herself without understanding why a man she knew was hitting her, as if trying to erase her every movement. In that small backroom space where the air conditioner buzzed non-stop and the cash register hung open, the scene turned into a suffocating enclosure of blows, noise, and broken breathing. When Minnie stopped moving, Randolph thought it was over. But she began breathing again, tried to get up. He improvised a ligature with the drawstring of his sweatshirt, strangled her, released her, returned several times to apply pressure to her neck, and when there were still signs of life, he grabbed a knife. He stabbed her in the neck, near the eye. The sexual assault happened afterward, in that forced silence where no one heard anything. Then he took a deep breath. He put on the store's blue apron, tore the camera from the ceiling, threw the cables into the trash can, and took Minnie's car keys. He walked outside as if he had simply finished a shift. Shortly after 7, regular customer Terry Sorrell arrived, along with Dorothy and Deborah Patilla, the cleaning staff. From the sidewalk, they saw the glass door closed from the inside by a man wearing the blue apron. It was Randolph. Sorrell asked about Minnie. Randolph said her car had broken down and she had taken his instead. But seconds later, they saw him get into Minnie's car and drive off without looking back. The metal shutters came down. The sense that something was wrong arrived immediately. They looked through the window. Something didn't fit. The camera ripped out, the counter in disarray, cables spilling from the overturned trash can, the door to the back room almost closed as if hiding the last movement of the morning. Dorothy ran to a phone to call the county sheriff. The first deputy arrived, broke a window, and went inside. Years later, he would still remember the scene. Spilled coffee, lights on, Minnie's body lying on her side, unclothed from the waist down, blood on the back of her head and neck, a knife nearby, and a faint, barely audible moan. Paramedics stabilized her just enough to transport her to the hospital. She arrived in a coma with irreversible brain damage. Dr. Albert Roten Jr., a neurologist, would later testify with words that froze the courtroom. In 20 years of neurosurgical practice, I had never seen such a diffuse cerebral swelling. It was comparable to someone thrown from a car or ejected from a motorcycle. Minnie survived 6 days on life support. Her family took turns in silence. While Minnie Ruth fought for her life, investigators worked to solve the case. The 3 witnesses were clear. The man in the store that morning was Richard Barry Randolph, a former employee. Once they had his name, the search intensified. The alert for the stolen vehicle was spread across the county. After the crime, Randolph stopped at the home of his girlfriend, Norma Janine Betts. He told her he had robbed the store and attacked Minnie. He said he would travel to Jacksonville to borrow money, cash lottery tickets, and then return for her so they could flee to North Carolina. On the way, he dumped his blood-stained clothes at a McDonald's, threw away the losing tickets, and cashed the winning ones at several stores. Police received the alert just a few hours later. A man matching the description was inside a Save-A-Lot store in Jacksonville, trying to cash tickets that weren't his. When officers arrived, Randolph was there. He didn't try to run. He waived his Miranda rights and confessed everything to Detective William Horde: the planning of the robbery, the moment Minnie surprised him, the times he went back to attack her when he heard she was still breathing, and the sexual assault he staged to make it look like the work of a maniac. He also showed them where he had thrown away his bloody clothes. With the confession, the tickets, Minnie's car, the clothing, and the witnesses, there was no doubt left. On August 21, 1988, Minnie Ruth McCollum died from the injuries she suffered in the attack. The robbery case had become a murder case. There was no turning back. By then, Randolph was 26 years old. What came out about his life didn't excuse anything, but it explained the abyss he had grown out of. He had been adopted at 5 months old by a family that, on the outside, looked stable. Inside, it was a different story. His adoptive father beat him with belts, broom handles, and fists. Sometimes he tied him up. Other times, he locked him in a dark closet for days. His adoptive mother, an alcoholic with psychiatric disorders, had been hospitalized multiple times. She constantly told him he was worthless. He was expelled from school in 6th and 7th grade, placed in therapy since 3rd grade. Yet no one, teachers or social workers, ever intervened. As an adult, he enlisted in the Army. He was discharged for drug use. His girlfriend later said that in North Carolina he had been stable, employed, but when he moved to Palatka, he fell into crack addiction, which she also said was crucial. On the morning of the crime, he was not high. He knew exactly what he was doing. Decades later, a change in New York adoption laws revealed that his biological mother, a 17-year-old girl named Wanda Branch Kelly, had searched for him his entire life, without knowing he had grown up in a violent home. Closed adoption laws had kept them apart for half a century. The ETE case against Richard Barry Randolph went to trial in 1988 in Putnam County before Judge Robert Perry. The small Florida courtroom filled with neighbors, reporters, and onlookers. No one could understand how a former Army serviceman had ended up accused of such a brutal crime. The prosecution presented 4 charges: first-degree murder, armed robbery, sexual battery by force, and vehicle theft. The evidence was as solid as it was painful to hear. The defendant's own confession, the testimony of the 3 witnesses who saw him close the store that morning, the blood-stained clothing he himself pointed out to police, the stolen items found in his possession, and the devastating testimony of Dr. Roten about the brain injuries he had never seen in 2 decades of practice. The prosecutor argued that Randolph had not acted on impulse. He had planned everything. He knew the store. He knew who opened it. He brought a toy gun to intimidate if necessary. And when Minnie Ruth McCollum caught him, he responded with a level of violence that went far beyond any attempt at robbery. Judge Perry summarized it in one sentence that remained in the record. The defendant returned to the victim 4 or 5 times while attempting to kill her. She was far more resilient than he expected. The prosecution sought the death penalty. 3 aggravators were met: murder during a robbery, murder during a sexual assault, and extreme cruelty. The defense asked for mercy. A psychologist, Dr. Harry Kropp, testified that Randolph had grown up in a violent adoptive home and that his childhood had been marked by abuse. But he testified for less than half a day. He had no access to medical records, family interviews, or a complete social history. The court ultimately concluded that Randolph had been loved by both parents, ignoring all evidence of abuse. State experts were categorical. He fully understood his actions. There was no loss of control, and he did not suffer from a mental illness. The jury deliberated for hours. 8 votes for death, 4 against. Not unanimous, but enough. In any other state, that split vote would have resulted in life imprisonment. In 1989, Judge Perry delivered the final sentence. Richard Barry Randolph would be executed by lethal injection. His fate was sealed. Then came the wait. 37 years in a single-cell unit, with systemic lupus diagnosed in 1990, while state and federal appeals unfolded one after another. During those years, Randolph converted to Islam and adopted the name Malik Abdul Sajjad, trying to find some meaning in the time he had left. In 2016, the Hearst versus Florida decision required unanimous jury verdicts for death sentences. Randolph believed he finally had a chance. His own sentence had been 8-4. But in 2021, the Florida Supreme Court ruled that the new requirement did not apply retroactively. In 2024, his defense filed a motion based on the discovery of his biological mother and the absence of genetic predisposition to violence. It wasn't enough. The final attempt focused on his lupus and the risk of pulmonary edema during lethal injection. Dr. Joel Zivit warned that it was highly likely he would experience suffocation while paralyzed. The court rejected the argument as untimely. In October 2025, Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant. "Justice delayed is justice denied," he said. This time, there were no appeals left. Execution. On November 20th, 2025, Richard Barry Randolph was transported from his death row cell to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison in Starka. He was 63 years old. 37 years had passed since his conviction, an extraordinarily long period, even by the standards of the U.S. capital punishment system. The execution was scheduled for 6 p.m. Under Florida protocol, the method was lethal injection, a combination of 3 drugs designed to induce sedation, paralysis, and finally cardiac arrest. At 6 p.m. on the 20th of November 2025, Richard Barry Randolph, also known as Malik Abdul Sajjad, was pronounced dead by the state of Florida for the 1,988 murder of Minnie Ruth McCollum. His execution marks the 17th carried out in the state this year. His final words have not been officially released, and although it was reported that he requested a cheeseburger, French fries, and ice cream as his last meal, full confirmation remains pending. With his death, the story reaches its conclusion.
The case of Richard Barry Randolph exposes a form of violence that erupts when least expected, in a place that should have been safe. A convenience store, a Monday morning, a hard-working woman opening her business as she had done hundreds of times, and a man who, when caught in the middle of a robbery, chose not to flee, but to respond with extreme brutality that ended a life. Minnie Ruth McCollum died 6 days after the attack, the victim of the devastating brain injuries caused by the blows. Her family waited nearly 4 decades for the sentence to be carried out. Randolph spent more than half his life in a cell, waiting for the day that finally arrived in November 2025. Randolph's execution closed one of the darkest chapters in the criminal history of Putnam County. But delayed justice does not bring back the dead, nor does it erase the pain of those left behind. Was justice served? That's for you to decide.
And this is Tremaine on death row, where he's been for 22 years, as he's getting closer and closer to the execution date for a murder that he did not commit.
After more than 21 years on death row, Tremaine Lamont Wood was scheduled to face execution in Oklahoma. His name had been in the state's records since the early 2000s, when a motel night ended in tragedy. However, he was granted clemency, and now he will spend the rest of his life in prison. What began as a minor robbery turned into a senseless death. Since then, his case divided public opinion, fueled appeals, and drew pleas for mercy. 2 decades later, the story finally reached its end, not through his execution, but through the revocation of his death sentence.
The Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board is recommending that condemned killer Tremaine Wood's death sentence be commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Governor Stitt has the authority to accept that or proceed with Wood's scheduled execution on November 13th. During his clemency hearing, Woods expressed remorse for the 2002 stabbing death of 19-year-old Ronnie Wimpf.
The biggest regret of my life happened on New Year's Eve 2001 when me and my brother decided to rob these 2 young men. It never should have happened. I had the power to say no that night and to say, we're not going to do this. I could have prevented Ronnie's death. I could have prevented Arnold from being in that situation and the trauma that he suffered. All the damage coming from that night, which destroyed their families as well as mine, was preventable. And I am the one who could have prevented it. Having the courage to stand up and man up and say that night and say no could have prevented all of this from happening. And for not doing that, I'm truly sorry.
Tremaine Wood is 46 years old. His lawyers claim his brother actually committed that murder.
It was the early hours of Tuesday, January 1st, 2002. While the United States rang out the year with fireworks and promises of change, Oklahoma City woke to empty streets and the distant echo of celebration. The party was over, but the consequences were only beginning. Under a clear, cold sky, with temperatures hovering around 50 degrees, the city tried to settle back into calm. Downtown, the Bricktown Brewery District had been packed, music and craft beer, toasts between strangers. Only 3 months after September 11th, the country still lived between grief and the desire to feel safe again. As the glow of bar lights marked the start of a new year, 2 young men from Montana, 19-year-old Ronnie Wimpf and his friend Arnold Kleinsasser, celebrated their first New Year's Eve away from home. They came from a Hutterite community, a rural and pacifist world where work, faith, and communal life were everything. They had left the fields and routine to travel the country with a harvest crew. Their stop in Oklahoma City was a simple layover on the way to Texas, They wanted a distraction, one different night. On New Year's Eve in Bricktown, they met two women, Brandy Warden and Lenita Bateman. The conversation was easy. The laughter felt natural. Over drinks and music, the women suggested continuing the night at a motel. Ronnie and Arnold agreed, naive, unaware that everything had been planned. They agreed to pay $210 for intimate company. What they did not know was that the women had other plans for them. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, 21-year-old Tremaine Wood and his older brother, Jaitan Jake Wood, were looking for quick cash. It was not the first time they cruised the motels in the south side of the city, places with broken cameras and transient guests. That night, the opportunity seemed ready. The women, their partners, had just given them the exact room number. The plan was simple. The women would pose as prostitutes, and the brothers would burst in afterward to rob the men. No trail, no witnesses, just easy money. Jake, recently out of prison, gave the orders. Tremaine followed as always. He had grown up in his shadow, seeking his approval even when he knew it was wrong. Shortly after 2 in the morning, the four left Bricktown's noise behind and headed to the motel near 7400 South May Avenue. Ronnie Wipf and Arnold Kleinsasser rented a room. They went in with Brandy and Lenita still laughing, with no idea what was coming. Minutes later, 3 calls were placed from the room phone, one to Jake's pager and another to Tremaine's number. They were the signals. Inside, the tension rose quickly. The women asked for $40 from each man, supposedly for their services. The young men paid, but when the women refused to continue, Ronnie demanded his money back. What followed was a chaotic moment, shouting, arguing, a door opening. The women ran out to the parking lot where a white car waited with Anit, the engine running. At 3:30 a.m., 2 men wearing ski masks forced their way into the room. One was tall and carried a handgun. The other, younger, held a knife. "Don't move!" a voice shouted. Arnold saw them for only a few seconds, covered faces, gloves, quick movements. "Give us the money," they demanded. Ronnie tried to defuse the situation, but they shoved him against the wall. Arnold handed over his wallet while the gun's barrel pressed against his head. Then he heard a short command, "Just shoot the bastard." A gunshot split the silence. The shot missed, or perhaps it was meant as a threat. At that same instant, Ronnie was stabbed once in the chest, a clean wound straight to the heart. Arnold stumbled into the hallway and ran, yelling for help. Ronnie fell without a word. The attackers ran for the exit. Kleinsasser's screams woke the neighboring rooms. An employee called 911. "Breathe, brother," someone trying to help was heard saying, but there was no pulse. Police arrived 10 minutes later. Ronnie Wipf's body lay on the floor, surrounded by blood. On the bed, rumpled sheets and a towel soaked in red marked the center of the chaos. On the floor, a bright shell casing, an open wallet, and beside the body, the dark trace of a single wound to the chest. There were no signs of gunshot injuries, no prolonged fight, only the heavy silence of something that had ended far too quickly. The first statement came from the survivor, Arnold Kleinsasser. He was still shaking as he spoke. He said the attackers wore masks, gloves, and dark clothing. One had a gun, the other a knife. He heard an order, "Just shoot the bastard." Then a gunshot, and then the dull thud of a body hitting the floor. He had not seen their faces. He did not know who they were. He remembered the sound. While the forensic technicians worked, detectives from the Oklahoma City Police Department began canvassing the area. In the parking lot, they found fresh tire marks, and the motel's security cameras had recorded 4 people entering together hours before the attack: Ronnie Wipf, Arnold Kleinsasser, and 2 unknown women. From there, the puzzle began to take shape. In the first hours of the day, patrols moved toward downtown, checking bars, cameras, and ATMs. At a nearby Walmart, a video showed 4 people buying ski masks and gloves the night before. The image quality was poor, but the figures were unmistakable: 2 men and 2 women together. Officers cross-checked call records and found more calls from the motel room to a pager linked to Jaitan Jake Wood and one to his brother Tremaine's residence. The overlaps left little room for doubt. Within days, detectives located the women, Brandy Warden and Lenita Bateman. During questioning, their stories shifted, but the pattern was the same. They admitted being at the motel and described what they knew: the plan, the robbery, and the names of those who burst in afterward. Arrest warrants were issued immediately. All 4 were arrested and charged with first-degree murder under the felony murder rule, which holds every participant in a violent felony responsible when someone dies, even if they were not the person who did the killing. Weeks later, Zhiton Jake Wood would confess that he had stabbed Ronnie Wipf. By then, it was too late. The system does not forget, and it rarely forgives. For the Wood brothers, their fate had been set since that early morning. There was no turning back. Remain Lamont Wood was born on October 9, 1979, in Guthrie, Oklahoma, the second of 3 brothers. His childhood unfolded in an atmosphere of fear. His mother, Linda Wood, was only 16 when she met Raymond Gross, a police officer nearly twice her age. What began as an uneven relationship turned into years of abuse. Raymond beat Linda regularly, handcuffed her, and dragged her out of the car along the road. Tremaine and his brothers grew up watching it. When they tried to protect her, they were beaten too. By the time his mother managed to escape, Tremaine was 8 years old, but the damage was already done. He had learned that love could hurt and that authority did not always mean protection. The system never intervened. No social worker, no teacher, no counselor. He was expelled from school several times during 6th and 7th grade, and no one ever asked why. Out on the streets, his older brother Jake became his model and his refuge. Jake was violent and unpredictable, but to Tremaine, he represented the strength he had never found in himself. By 22, Tremaine was already a father trying to stay in touch with his children. He lived with little money, no steady job, and a constant sense that life was running out of his control. That blind loyalty to his brother would become the breaking point. On New Year's Eve 2001, family devotion and learned violence came together in a single act. And from that night on, nothing was ever the same. The trial of Tremaine Wood began in 2004 in Oklahoma County. 2 years after the crime, the case reached a jury that would hear how a New Year's celebration had turned into tragedy. The trial lasted 6 days. The prosecution sought the death penalty. Their strategy was simple but devastating. Under Oklahoma's felony murder law, they did not need to prove that Tremaine had stabbed Ronnie Wipf. It was enough to show that he had participated in the robbery during which the death occurred. Everyone involved in the felony was legally responsible for the murder, no matter who held the knife. The prosecutor presented the Walmart video showing the 4 suspects buying masks and gloves, the motel phone records, and the testimonies of the 2 women, Brandy Warden and Lenita Bateman. But beyond the evidence, he crafted a clear narrative. Tremaine Wood was the man who stabbed the victim. He painted him as violent, dangerous, and remorseless, a killer. The defense, by contrast, was almost non-existent. His attorney, John Albert, was in crisis. He struggled with drug and alcohol addiction, handled more than 100 cases at the same time, and according to his own billing records, spent only 2 hours preparing Tremaine's case outside the courtroom. He never investigated Tremaine's history of childhood abuse. He never spoke with witnesses who could have helped. He never presented psychological mitigation or family context, and he never called experts to challenge the prosecution's theory. The jury was almost entirely white. Tremaine was biracial. The judge, Ray Elliott, had previously been accused of making racist remarks in other cases. No one objected to his presence. In August 2004, the verdict was read: guilty of first-degree murder. The jury voted for death, but the story didn't end there. The following year, in 2005, Tremaine's brother, Zhiton Jake Wood, was tried separately. In that second trial, something extraordinary happened. The prosecutors completely changed their theory of the case. Now they argued that Jake was the one who had stabbed Ronnie Wipf, not Tremaine. They presented as evidence Jake's own testimony from his brother's trial, in which he had confessed to being the killer. They also introduced letters Jake had allegedly written from prison, where he bragged about the murder and said he had enjoyed it. They have evidence from the defendant's own mouth that he, in fact, murdered Ronnie Wipf, the prosecutor told the jury. He didn't just murder him, he liked it, he enjoyed it. Jake Wood was represented by the Oklahoma Indigent Defense System, with 3 capital defense attorneys and 2 investigators. His team presented mitigating evidence, built a full background, and humanized him before the jury. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, but this time they voted to let him live. Jake Wood was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tremaine, whose role as the actual killer was never proven, had already been sentenced to die. Years later, John Albert, Tremaine's attorney, wrote him a short note on a business card. "I'm sorry for everything in the past. You caught me at a bad time, and it's not your fault. It's mine." Soon after, Albert lost his license. He died in 2018. When the verdict had been read years earlier, Tremaine hadn't reacted. His brother, the confessed killer, would live. He, who had merely followed a badly planned crime, would die. The die was cast. After the verdict, Tremaine Wood was transferred to death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. He was 24 years old. There began a wait that would last more than 2 decades. During the first years, his defense appealed relentlessly. They argued that his attorney had been ineffective, that he had never presented evidence of Tremaine's abusive childhood, that he had failed to call witnesses or investigate the facts. The courts acknowledged the errors but ruled that they were not enough to overturn the conviction. Meanwhile, his brother Jake, the confessed killer, served a life sentence in another prison. In 2019, he took his own life in his cell. That news changed Tremaine. He began to write, to study, to work as a janitor in H Unit. Over time, he became a calming figure among the inmates, someone others turned to for guidance. He spent 21 years on death row, 21 years watching the sun through a narrow slit, with the date of his execution marked on the state's calendar. On November 5, 2025, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 3-2 to recommend clemency. The defense reminded the board of the original jury, almost entirely white, the judge who had made racist remarks and the attorney who had worked barely 2 hours on a case of life and death. Even the victim's mother, Barbara Wipf, and the survivor, Arnold Kleinsasser, publicly asked that he not be executed. Governor Kevin Stitt heard arguments from both sides. Days later, he rejected the recommendation for clemency. The execution of Tremaine Wood was set for November 13, 2025. On the 13th of November 2025, in the early hours of the morning, Tremaine Wood was waiting in his cell at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, just moments away from his scheduled execution. Everything was prepared when, unexpectedly, the news arrived. Governor Kevin Stitt had granted clemency. The decision, made only minutes before the execution was set to proceed, commuted his sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In a last-minute turn of fate, Tremaine Wood's life was spared.
After a thorough review of the facts and prayerful consideration, I have chosen to accept the Pardon and Parole Board's recommendation to commute Tremaine Wood's sentence to life without parole, said Governor Stitt. This action reflects the same punishment his brother received for their murder of an innocent young man and ensures a severe punishment that keeps a violent offender off the streets forever. In Oklahoma, we will continue to hold accountable those who commit violent crimes, delivering justice, safeguarding our communities, and respecting the rule of law. I pray for the family of Ronnie Wipf and for the surviving victim, Arnie. They are models of Christian forgiveness and love.
The execution scheduled for November 13, 2025, was canceled. On November 13, 2025, Tremaine Lamont Wood was not executed. Instead, he remained in his cell at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, where he will spend the rest of his life. Governor Kevin Stitt's decision to grant clemency was historic, only the second time since executions resumed in 2021 that Oklahoma spared a death row inmate at the last moment. The Wood family released a statement thanking the governor and promising that Tremaine would continue his personal transformation behind bars. The victim's mother, Barbara Wipf, and survivor Arnold Kleinsasser, who had publicly advocated for clemency, expressed relief. With that signature, the governor acknowledged what many had pointed out for years. The case of Tremaine Wood had been marked by procedural inequalities, inadequate defense, and fundamental contradictions in the state's theory of the crime. The death penalty was halted. But the question remained, had justice arrived or had a greater injustice simply been avoided?
The case of Tremaine Lamont Wood exposes some of the deepest flaws in the American criminal justice system. Two brothers took part in the same robbery. One confessed to driving the knife into a man's chest. The other was never proven to have stabbed anyone. Under the same law, the confessed killer received life in prison. The other was sentenced to death. But the injustice did not end there. In Tremaine's trial, prosecutors argued that he was the killer. A year later in Jake's trial, the same office argued the exact opposite, that Jake had killed Ronnie Whipf. Same prosecutors, same office, opposite theories. The truth became secondary. What mattered was the conviction. Tremaine Wood was tried in 6 days by a lawyer who spent only 2 hours preparing his defense outside of court. A lawyer struggling with addiction, handling more than 100 cases, who never investigated the childhood abuse that could have saved his client's life. His brother Jake was defended by 3 capital specialists and 2 investigators. The difference was not the crime, it was the budget. The jury that condemned Tremaine was almost entirely white. He was biracial. The judge had a documented history of racist comments in other cases. No one challenged him. And then came the most extraordinary part. The victim's family asked for mercy. Barbara Whipf, Ronnie's mother, and Arnold Kleinsasser, the survivor of the attack, publicly opposed Tremaine Wood's execution. They, who had the greatest right to demand retribution, chose forgiveness. They spoke of their Christian faith, of the futility of more violence, and of how killing Tremaine would not bring Ronnie back. Was justice served? That's for you to decide. Leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and watch more cases like this. This was Final Sentence.